Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Dmitrijs Kravčenko.
Hi. Hey, pleasure to be here. It's a fantastic opportunity. Thanks for inviting me.
Not at all, and it's a pleasure to have you on, man. Thank you very much for joining us. For our listeners who don't know Dmitrijs by name, you may know him better as Latvian Football Podcast over on Twitter. He is a person to go to for anything you want to know about Latvian football, past, present, and possibly even the future, who knows. And he's going to be joining us tonight to talk through one club in particular from Latvia that piqued our interest. It's a lost club. Dmitrijs, you want to tell our listeners the name of the club that we're going to be discussing tonight?
Maybe first I address the very flattering accusations that you made. First of all, it's not just me that at the podcast, it's also Frank and Gustav's, and it's very kind of you to say that I know so much about Latvian football. That's probably not true, but I do my best to highlight the game and the game in Latvia to the international audience to the best of my ability. And today I'm genuinely delighted to get the opportunity to speak about a very special city in our country. The city is called Liepāja, and it's something of a hotspot of football in Latvia. And we'll be talking about different clubs from Liepāja because they can generally be traced in a single lineage of a club called Olimpija.
Yeah, you're spot on there. And I think that's what I found very, very interesting about Olimpija is that you have this one city, Liepāja, as you mentioned. And even though it seems like there's been lots of football clubs that have come through it, in reality, a lot of them can actually be tied to this original entity, if you like, of Olimpija. And it's all very, very fascinating because through this one club, you can almost get a sense of the history of football and the growth of football in Latvia as well, just by going through the different eras and the different name changes and all of the other football clubs and football aspects, I suppose, that have been tied to it.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the history of Olimpija is the history of Latvia, and it's very complex and convoluted. And of course, Olimpija is the early incarnation of Liepāja football. It's one of the first clubs of the newly independent Latvia. But then if we look at it as this sort of ghost that followed the city through the years, you can very much kind of get a sense of what Latvia as a nation is all about and the trials and trepidations that we've gone through over the years of being part of the Russian Empire, the initial independence, the Soviet occupation, then the restoration of independence. And whilst Olimpija no longer exists, football in Liepāja is, well, as of this season, alive and well, which is very exciting. How do you want to do this? How shall we go about it? It can get complicated tracking through the years.
Yeah, it certainly can. I suppose the best place to start for now, you've already introduced yourself very briefly, but why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself first of all?
Yeah, so I'm the host and creator of the Latvian Football Podcast, which is now in its second year. We're very, very new. Inspiration came from your compatriots who do the Estonian Football Podcast, in essence. I've spotted it one day and realized, well, if there's so much interest in Estonian football, I mean, ours is so much better. So it's just a debt that we owe to our land. So, but no, I mean, no, that's obviously a joke. And the guys are great, and we've met a few times and even done a podcast together. So our show is literally aimed at talking about Latvian football to an international audience. There are very few resources in English available about Latvian football, which is something that I've discovered as I've gone onto a journey of rediscovering the game, because I lived abroad in England for many, many years, and then having come back in 2019, sort of just had this hunger for all things Latvian suddenly, and football became one of them. So this is what the show is about. We meet, we talk about what's happening. This season we're trying to be a bit more serious and kind of do a bit of more research, not just chat about football, and try to kind of unpeel the onion of Latvian football in Virsliga specifically, which is the name of our top tier, to any football connoisseurs, as we like to frame it.
And it's an excellent show as well. But of course, many of our listeners may have also saw your collaboration, I suppose, and interaction with the Estonian Football Podcast, who, as you mentioned, are a fantastic group of lads as well. Really doing your bit for football in the Baltic states. And it's great seeing all of these different podcasts and initiatives and shows and Twitter pages. But in terms of the club we're going to be discussing today, where to start is probably a really good good question. You can go back to 1945 or perhaps even further.
We need to go way before that. And I think a good place to start is at the beginning of football in Latvia, which dates, well, in Latvia as a whole, football began in 1907. 1907 were the first clubs formed, one by members of a British-owned metal foundry, and that became the aptly named British Football Club, later Britannia Football Club, and the other one was Union Riga, which was a club by Baltic Germans. Later Kaiserwald, which is actually a place where Riga FC has their training base currently, an artificial pitch, joined the fray. But in everywhere other than Riga, where clubs that were generally run and championed by foreigners kind of managed to take root, football kind of had a very troubled relationship, much like it has now in Latvia. It didn't really stick, so to speak. And in fact, when I was reading some archival documents on football in Liepāja, one of the first mentions of football as such was this article in a newspaper where the author is being very puzzled about this very niche sport, that why would anyone want to take it up if cycling apparently was very popular at the time, when you can just be cycling and feeling the wind in your hair, I think was a quote in that article, although later acknowledging that bicycles are expensive and not affordable to everyone, and football only needs a ball, but still kind of making a bold prediction that it's never going to be taken up en masse and be popular. And so that's sort of how it was everywhere outside Riga, and up until World War I, and then during the war, and we declared our independence in 1918, and then had immediately a war of independence to secure that all the way up until 1920, and then the first team in Liepāja was founded in 1920. It didn't have a name that survived through time, but it had a funny story that the reason it even came about was because a guy called Baumanis had a ball left over from the pre-war times, and so he started the team around this one single football. And then in 1920, the first teams were founded, including Olimpija, which came about in 1922. So there were two teams at the time in Liepāja. One was a team of the Latvian National Youth Association, kind of like YMCA of the day, I suppose. And the other one was Olimpija a couple of years later. And Olimpija was the worst of the two teams, all the way throughout its initial years of existence. And they competed. It was just that, a couple of regional teams playing football, no big deal. There wasn't a national championship at the time. That only happened in 1927 and only with 4 teams. And so they were fighting amongst each other. And football, in contradiction to the cycling enthusiast that I quoted earlier, it did stick, and it stuck for a very interesting reason that also was speculated at the time, that Latvians were colonized for 700 years, basically, by Baltic Germans. But on a football pitch, the argument went, it didn't matter who you were, or where you were from, or what was your name, or anything like that. And it had this very meritocratic, very kind of you prove yourself on the pitch as a team kind of a spirit that very much appealed to the population that were now experiencing their first independence. And in a sense, it had this very romantic quality that we still, I think, associate with football now. That, all right, you can have these state hedge fund-owned teams, but at the end of the day, it's going to be decided on the field. It doesn't matter the money, it doesn't matter, your upbringing or anything. It's about 11v11, a ball, and 2 nets. And that really came to the fore back in those very, very early days. And especially in places like Liepāja, that unlike Riga, were not a majority foreign population centers. And so Virslīga, the championship, was founded in 1927, and Olimpija, which by that time had grown some muscle, immediately won it 3 times in a row, and then got 2 more silvers.
It's really interesting something that you've said there, and it kind of comes back to discussions that we've had on other episodes. Particularly the one that sticks out in my mind is the recent episode that we released on Athletic Club, where there's this sort of similar theme running through of it doesn't matter how you got there, and sometimes it doesn't even matter how you win, but it's how you win. What matters is you playing on the field. What matters is how you conduct yourself on the pitch. And it really comes back to this kind of mentality that shows that it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter your race, colour or creed, you do your talking on that football pitch. And it's actually something that we've come across quite a lot, actually, when we've been speaking to fans of football from nations that have been oppressed or colonised, as you mentioned there, fans of football clubs who represent people that have been oppressed in the past. So it's very much something that's common amongst people throughout the world, and that football was their means to prove themselves either to others or to stand for their people and represent them in that sense. So it's amazing just to hear how this is something that can be found all over the world in terms of football as well. But of course, as you mentioned, this is really our starting point, and it's really the beginnings of football in Latvia. And as you said, all through this, for centuries, Latvia was colonised by Germans, and then obviously there is independence, but unfortunately it doesn't last very long, and there's so many other stages where Latvia has been colonised and again oppressed, just so many other empires and forces that have been at play here.
Yeah, so in 1927, Virslīga starts and Olimpija wins it 3 times in a row, then once again in 1933, and then once again in 36, and then last time in 1939. And we all know what happened in 1939 in the rest of Europe. And so Latvia gets occupied by the Soviets for the first time. Okay, I don't want to say nothing really happens, but in terms of Olimpija, not much happens. And so in 1940, they even managed to play a game against the occupying Red Army Football Club and win it 7-3 in front of 4,000 spectators, to great delight of the local residents. Then Germans roll in, and of course, following this win, the club basically gets disbanded. But then Germans roll in, club gets reinstated. It plays throughout the German occupation years. And in this part of Latvia, that was basically until the end of the war, and in fact, literally up to the last day, because of the Kurland cauldron, so to speak, the part of Latvia where Liepāja is, it kind of held out as this isolated pocket until the very, very end. And then World War II ends everywhere else, and we remain under Soviet occupation. Of course, you can't have any Olimpija or any independent, any symbols of the independent Latvia. So instead of Olimpija, you have Daugava, which is now the new Liepāja club. It's basically Olimpija. It's pretty much the same core, but it has a different name. It was a very bizarre name also, because Liepāja is nowhere near the Daugava River, but obviously the occupying powers that were didn't really care all that much about things, silly things like that. So in 1946, 1947, this Daugava wins the Latvian championship and even the cup. And by the way, nowadays, Daugava Stadium in Liepāja, where Football Club Liepāja plays, that's why it's named that. It's because of this particular team. Because again, the river Daugava that runs through Riga is nowhere to be found in those parts. But then, because this team gets pretty good, well, the best players begin to be shipped off to the leading Riga teams, the Riga Dynamo and Riga Daugava. So you could only have basically Dynamo or Daugava teams at the time. And so Liepāja begins to get poached, and so they begin to struggle.
So obviously they begin to struggle because their players are getting poached. Now, one thing that I was going to ask during this era, and I think you've kind of alluded to it already, is of course within many nations within the Soviet Eastern Bloc, you had several teams allied to, the army, the police force, different factories and different trade unions, normally under the names of Dynamo, or Partizan, etc., etc. I'm assuming that there was something similar in Latvia, where the best players from teams across the country would effectively be poached for the team that was closest aligned to the state, whether that have been the army, the police, etc. Just whoever the club favourite was for the powers that be in Latvia, the best players would end up at that team, and the other teams would just be left with whoever else was left.
Well, yeah, in essence, the idea was that in the Soviet Union there were two teams, one run by the army, one run by the KGB, basically, and those were either a Dynamo or Spartak. We didn't really have a Spartak. We had either Dynamo or Daugava. I genuinely couldn't tell now which of them would be aligned to which, but in essence, pretty much every city, including Liepāja, also had a Dynamo team, right? But in Latvia, the leading one was Daugava Riga. That was the one that was sort of the poster child of the football of this land in that particular superstate organization. And because of that, you obviously can't have competition because it's the Soviet Union. You just need to have your representation, as it were. So best players from anywhere else would be taken, on a bus or a train, and then they would play for that particular team. And the idea was that you would have one super strong team, almost like a national representation on a club level, and then that would be what they would call the master team. You may know that Soviets were very much obsessed with masters of this or that sport or whatever. But that was the idea. It wasn't meant to be by means of healthy competition like we have now, but rather by this artificial, assemblage of things. And that's what happened to this particular Liepāja team as well. They were good, but they were not in the right city. They weren't a capital city team, so they couldn't be good by design. And so they were taken apart, and they began to struggle. And in essence, football in Liepāja became a bit of a farce during those years. And those two teams, Daugava Liepāja and Dynamo Liepāja, really by the late 40s, there was no point to have both of them. So they were both merged under the umbrella of a newly founded metallurgical plant in the city, and they became the Red Metallurg, or in Latvian, Sarkanais Metallurgs, essentially. Red standing for the color of the Soviet Revolution, and Metallurg standing for the metallurgical plant. And this is the birth of this Metallurg umbrella term that will dominate Latvian and Liepāja football all the way until pretty much 2014 in one way or another.
Wow, it's really, really fascinating just hearing how the names of these clubs come about. And of course, many of our listeners might themselves know by looking at these team names that they come from certain plants, certain industrial works. Again, we've discussed it in other episodes. It was incredibly common within the Soviet Union, but not just there as well. It's common in football wherever you go. It's a very common thing in Britain as well. But of course, there's these other things in the background and other contexts that we need to talk about when we're discussing teams, particularly from the former Soviet bloc as well. Now they almost have a bit of a new lease of life because they have this new name. Do their fortunes change whatsoever coming into the era of the Cold War?
Well, I mean, that would be mildly put. The moment Red Metallurg comes into existence, it simply dominates Latvian football for the next 11 years. And in their first season, they do not lose any points. So, talk about Liverpool not losing a game that one season. There's no draws either. They score 121 goals in 22 games, concede only 9, win every single thing, and essentially they continue in more or less this stride for the next just a bit over a decade. Now, an interesting thing about this new Red Metallurg team is that it was pretty much 100% made up of locals, not even Latvians, like not even people from the broader Kurland region, but it was pretty much made up of people from the city of Liepāja. And that created some very interesting rivalries and some very interesting conflicts that underlined. At this time still, there was an armed resistance movement in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So people weren't really particularly enthused at being occupied for obvious reasons. But essentially, this Red Metallurg team developed a rivalry with the Soviet Officers Club team from Riga, which had conversely zero locals, zero Latvians. It was all Soviet officers. You know that all the teams that are called CSK, that's basically the Soviet army teams or the Soviet officer teams, because that abbreviation stands for Central Sporting Club of the Army. So anyway, there were some very interesting clashes. Fans started clashing from 1946, still at the times of Daugava, but it really came to a head in 1951 at the conclusion of the Latvian Championship, which was decided in that game between the Red Metallurg and this Soviet Officers Club team, and a major brawl broke out in the stadium between the supporters of the two teams, but because it was very much along the lines of locals versus occupants, it had a very significant underlayer to it that is not just fans becoming rowdy.
Definitely not. I think undercurrent's the really important word there again. I think this was mentioned in the episode done on Union Berlin with Kit Holden. I think he put it brilliantly when he said that these football grounds, although they weren't the places where revolutions kicked off, there were certainly places where people were able to come under a common banner and sing the same things for around 90 minutes, which was incredibly rare in the Eastern Bloc, and effectively they acted as these spaces and these interactions took place in them where the people were effectively saying to police at the time and the authorities, this is our space, we are taking it back. So there you have this act of aggression taking place. And again, as you mentioned, when it's an oppressed people, they're not going to be happy about that. So there's obviously going to be these interactions that take place. But of course, as well, after, they were winning title after title and they were really dominating. But it was 1954 that after they beat one of the teams from Riga in a match, that they earned the chance to play in the Soviet League as well, which is a competition we haven't really touched on before in this podcast.
Yeah, so in 1960, Red Metallurg gets promoted to the Soviet B League. So the way the Soviet pyramid worked, I think, not an expert on this, but you had your national championships, then you had a layer above that, then you had the B League, then you had the A League, and then you had the Soviet Super League or whatever. So B League was essentially the entry into the international pan-Soviet pyramid. And of the Latvian clubs, very few played at that level. And I'm not sure if any even played at the highest level. In the A League, the Daugava from Riga played. Then Žalgiris from Vilnius may have played in the top one, but I'm not a historian of Soviet football. But in essence, yeah, Red Metallurg gets promoted to the Soviet B League, and it kind of undergoes a little bit of a period of Russification, because it is now this master team in Soviet terminology. A whole bunch of players get imported. They have a new coach. They have some more players. The local players become bench warmers or get pushed out of the team altogether. So the team changes significantly. And in 2 years' time, it even changes the name. No longer is Red Metallurg, it becomes Zvejnieks. And Zvejnieks in Latvian means fisherman. So it becomes this fisherman team, which is a significant football entity in its own right. This newly renamed team struggles, generally speaking, and kind of scrapes the bottom of the league, but stays up until the 80s, when they get their act together and manage to get up to the 6th place twice. And, by that point, we're already in the dying breaths of the Soviet Union. And in 1990, this team gets renamed back to Olimpija, which is then finishing the last year of this B League, not just for themselves, but in its existence. And in 1991, Latvia regains independence and Virslīga becomes reinstated.
Yeah, and this is really the birth, maybe, of the club as many people may know it or remember it today, of course, as the Soviet Union falls. club goes through another name change and becomes Olimpija Liepāja. And I believe they had some European exploits as well. Of course, they went through another few name changes as the 90s went on, actually right up until the demise in 2013. It very much from the end of World War II up until the fall of the Soviet Union, it's a club that's experienced every possible high and every possible low. They were really dominant for a period of time. They challenged in the Soviet B League, as you mentioned, and then they went through this period of Russification, and it's almost as if not that they couldn't handle it in a lot of ways, but the club changed not just in terms of the players that it was recruiting, but also in name. And it lost, to me anyway, it seems like it lost a bit of itself when it done that, because you're effectively shedding one identity and trying to take on another. And it's a very, very risky move doing that when you're a football club.
Well, we need to be a little bit careful at this point with the terminology that we use, because what we understand to be a football club today is not that, right? So they weren't a club in the way that we understand clubs to be, which is an entity with mission, strategy, some kind of local footprint that has agency. They were more of a sports organization. And while they were playing in Latvian league, which by Soviet standards was a backwater, they could at least in practice, if not in theory, exercise some of that. Once they were promoted, and promoted here being more in a sense of pull rather than push, and entered the stage that is, a bottom tier, but still on the Soviet Union level, they would become a sports organization, not a club. So many of these things that you mentioned now about player recruitment, change in identity, really not their call anymore. Because in a sense, much like with other Soviet things that were kind of more publicly on display, you don't get to decide out of risk that it might contradict the official storyline or the story that wants to be told. A good example of this is this weird initiative at one point in the Soviet Union when the Central Communist Party decided that they want every constituent country to have their own dog breed for absolutely no reason whatsoever. So these artificial dog breeds were created. It's similar with these football clubs. So once it got promoted to Soviet B League, yes, higher level of football for sure, but in essence the soul of the club was sent to a spiritual gulag at that point. And it was no longer a club from Liepāja. In reality, Liepāja lost a football club once Red Metalurg got promoted to this B League, because football in Liepāja was no longer any kind of a priority. It was just a team that was in a city, could have been in any other city, would have made no difference.
Okay, so once the Soviet Union falls and the team adopt the name Olimpija, do things change? Do supporters begin flocking back, or is it a case of more of the same? Did supporters start coming back to the club at that point, or was it just too far gone and the club went too far from its roots, is what I'm trying to say, for any fans to decide they wanted to come back? I mean, in some ways, it could have also been a chance for a clean slate.
Yeah. Also to note that the demographics of the city had undergone pretty irreversible changes, since the Olimpija last played in the Latvian Championship in the early 40s. So there's also that to account for. But generally, it was a time of great excitement. In 1991, when Virslīga resumed and Olimpija was part of it, people in the city were genuinely very excited that Olimpija might again lift Latvian gold and it might again dominate Latvian championship. And these hopes were very, very high, but ultimately completely misplaced, because Olimpija, well, they start off strong, and in the first season they get silver, but then they get relegated in 1995, and they become FK Liepāja, not the same one that we have today, basically just become Football Club Liepāja. Now, on a technicality, they don't actually stay in the second division because they merge with a club from Riga called DAG, and so they become DAG Liepāja and remain in Virslīga only on this technicality alone. Generally, great excitement, gives way to great disappointment at that point. But people are still showing up. People are excited. Attendances are pretty decent. And this new DAG/Liepāja team, they do all right. They make their European debut against Feyenoord from the Netherlands. They lose a combined 13-0, but nobody minds. It's all exciting. People are excited. And of course, at that time, since '91, Skånte Riga is becoming an unstoppable force, and no one really has any expectations that Liepāja can challenge that remnant of Soviet ideology. Where you have this one team that is so obviously superior. But eventually, Liepāja does become that team that challenges, and it's the first team that took gold that wasn't Skånte Riga. Eventually, many years later. But so this DAG Liepāja doesn't live too long. In '97, so 2 years later, it struggles financially, and that's where the Liepājas Metallurgs comes in. So the Liepāja metallurgical plant, which was a successor of the metallurgical plant that took Liepāja's Daugava all the way back in 1949 under its wing. It was trying to make its way in a capitalist system, and it was doing all right, and they took the Liepāja club under their wing, and that, at this point, really resulted in the flourishing of Liepāja football once again, and for the first time since the restoration of independence.
Yeah, definitely. And it was really interesting seeing all these different name changes, and as mentioned, a football club's name can say a lot about its owners. It can say a lot about its intentions and a lot about its identity as well. And you really go from Olimpija to FK to DAG, and then Baltica as well. And all of those names have different connotations and different things behind them. So it's really fascinating seeing this transition. But as you mentioned yourself as well, a lot of clubs and a lot of clubs across the world at this point in time were really trying to find their feet in new political and economic systems that some of which had no experience of before. And that in itself would be challenging. That in itself would be incredibly turbulent. You've got loads of people wanting to get involved a lot of the time for very, very wrong reasons as well. And the fact that this club from Liepāja managed to make it through this is testament to how strong they actually became as well. And obviously, they were adopted by this metallurgical plant. They very much got Metallurgs back in their name, and they stuck with this name right up until 2013 as well. And this was the time when, I suppose you could say, they really began to settle for a period.
During this time, so starting from 1997 up until the early 2010s, it was exciting to be in Liepāja. The club was growing, and they became a force that people could be proud of. It was a time with the current coach of Grobinja, Viktor Dobricovs, being this epic striker. Young child Maris Verpakovskis was coming through the ranks, who would become the top scorer for Latvian national team of all time, and currently the general manager of RFS. And many other very exciting players. The team was coached by the first coach of the Latvian national team, who himself was a very fascinating character. Sadly, no longer with us. And it was just fun. I almost wish I could have been there, but I was. I suppose if I was born in Liepāja, I would have, but I was a bit too young to be traveling for football, and I'm arguably not that interested at that young age. But the team started challenging for Latvian gold, and Skånte Riga basically went undefeated between 1991 till 2004 in terms of getting back-to-back Latvian Virslīga goals, and then Liepājas Metallurgs was the first team in 2005 to interrupt this. It was followed by 3 Ventspils titles, and then again Liepāja. And only then in 2010, 6 years later, Skånte regained the Latvian championship. So really a very important team, very much resurrecting the football passion in the city. Were they doing it in the same way as the original Olimpija back in the 1920s was? What we talked about, well, you go on the field and it's just you and your effort, doesn't matter where you're from and such. That's a little bit harder to tell, and it's a bit of a different conversation about the sociology of football fans and what football even represented so many years later and having gone through so much. But at the end of the day, this team was tied to the metallurgical plant, and metallurgical plant could not cope with the international competition and the international markets, and so it began to go bankrupt, and it went finally into administration in late 2013 and took the team down with it. And Liepājas Metallurgs ceased to exist in 2013.
It's a real shame. But again, it's something that we've seen so much of and something that we've talked about so much on this show is that when clubs are tied so intrinsically to corporations or companies, even industries, or just relying on one sole person, the minute the money is taken from them, then that's it. It's curtains, for that club. And some of them, in some cases, have limped on for a little bit. But for the most part, when the money goes, that's it, because they know that it's very, very difficult to come back from such a hammer blow to have all of your finances just taken away from you. But like you said there as well, we could have a whole other discussion about whether or not the club then and suppose now operates in the same way as the original Olimpija, where you do your talking on the pitch. Completely different period of time now. Football has completely changed, as you said, but the club has a spiritual successor. And some people maybe say that they were replaced, though, by FK Liepāja. And there's a few other clubs from Liepāja as well who have come in since. Some people say they've taken up the Metallurgs mantle. Others say they haven't. What do you think, Dmitrijs? Can these clubs be considered successors to Liepāja Metallurgs, or are they just new clubs that were founded with no connection to them whatsoever?
Well, that's a bit of a complex question, so let's unpack it a little bit. FK Liepāja, which is the team that immediately rose out of the ashes of Liepājas Metallurgs in 2014, is essentially a repeat of the story when back in immediately post-World War II period, the Liepājas Daugava team rose out of the ashes of Olimpija, of the original Olimpija. So in that sense, yeah, a good chunk of players came over, the ones who didn't go to Riga or elsewhere, and kind of the core of the team, or at least a healthy proportion of the core of the new FK Liepāja, was indeed Liepājas Metallurgs. So in that sense, yeah, definitely a continuation. If we're looking at the ownership structure, Liepājas Metallurgs was owned by this corporation. The new FK Liepāja, at that point in time, was not really owned by any majority investor as such. There was a range of investors, but generally it was kind of a diversified, albeit relatively poor football club. But that only lasted for a couple of years. If we are looking at it from the perspective of the original Olimpija was a club that was a club of the city, and then the Red Metallurg, as I mentioned, was 100% made up of locals, or pretty much 100%. In that sense, FK Liepāja was not following in the footsteps of its predecessors. There were local players, and there were locals in the management. So Verpakovskis, who had played for Dynamo Kyiv and Getafe and a whole bunch of other clubs, by that point had retired from football and came back to help found this team. So he was the general manager, and so there's a connection to Liepājas Metallurgs and the history before. His father played for Zvainieks, for example. In that sense, the connection is there. In a sense of putting emphasis on local players and local talent, not so much. So it's a little bit difficult to say decisively, yes, this is a continuation of this or that. As you said, football was changing, and Liepāja and Latvia altogether underwent natural and not so natural changes and changes in course, maybe not of own volition over the years of the occupation. But I think if we zoom out and kind of look at it broadly, yeah, FK Liepāja at that point in time took up the tradition that they inherited from Liepājas Metallurgs, which inherited from Zvejnieks, which inherited it from Red Metal. The lineage is there and it's clear. There weren't like offshoot teams that there was usually another team in Liepāja, but this is the line and the lineage that is easily traceable. Now, FK Liepāja, founded in 2014, won Latvian championship under Viktoras Dobricovs, who was the famous striker back in the late 90s. And then a couple of years later ran into financial difficulties again, a story all too familiar. And so they turned to a person who was a minority investor, and he became a majority investor / full-on owner. And the person is Oleg Khamov, who is a Russian-origin Liepāja-based shipping magnate and real estate mogul. And so he, starting from 2018, if I'm not mistaken, essentially became the full owner of this football club, at which point it had changed course significantly. And I think people who say that FK Liepāja of today is not worthy of the Liepāja football heritage, that is the point in time that they're referring to, that this turn away from local into foreign for no real reason maybe is echoing a little bit back in the days when the Red Metallurg was undergoing Russification, having been promoted to the Soviet B League. And maybe consciously or not consciously, that really rubs people the wrong way.
Completely understandable as well. I mean, what I quite like about the discussion that we've been having so far is that often on the show, when we're talking about clubs, we talk about teams having a lineage or being like a spiritual successor, or even just being a direct successor to a particular club. But we've never really broken down what that actually means, and I think you've put that perfectly, Dmitrijs, in how a club can actually be considered a successor. And like you said, more often than not, it is very, very complicated. There's loads of ways that you can look at a football team being a successor to one club or another, and there's loads of ways that you can justify it, and loads of research that has to be done into it. And I think what is perfect about that is that you've also pinpointed the exact moment that they shed whatever claim they had to being the successor of the Metallurgs team from the 90s. However, you've also mentioned there, and I think what is really, really important when we discuss football clubs like this, is you always have to take a step back. You always have to look at it in the bigger picture, as you say, just zoom out a little bit. And as you said, at the time, FK Liepāja were the club who took the mantle up from other clubs who had dissolved. That's not to say they were particularly a successor, but it means to say that the footballing responsibilities or duties of the city, if you like, were passed on to them.
Yeah, and this is where the interesting bit comes in, because even though they took up the mantle of representing the city, but no longer necessarily representing the football of the city, so we're kind of carefully disentangling different strands of this particular football story, and keeping in mind this idea that the greatest success of Red Metallurg was whilst they were pretty much fully local, and Olimpija before that wasn't exactly scouting for foreigners in the 1920s either, although they did have foreign coaches, simply because there were no Latvian coaches so early back in the day, and they had it's a bit of a morbid story, but one of their more successful coaches was an Austrian guy who was later executed by occupying Germans once the club was reinstated following Soviet initial withdrawal. But anyway, the interesting bit comes in that in so far as representatives of the city, FK Liepāja may as well be. It's a modern international city now, so you wouldn't expect it to be fully local. Insofar as them being representatives of Liepāja's football, on the other hand, no way. There's just no. there's no way in any kind of rationalization that anyone could legitimately, rationally, authoritatively claim and support that claim that FK Liepāja that we have today is in any way a representation of the football tradition of that city, which is what we talked about for almost an hour now. It's just, no, they're not. They turned away from that in 2018 deliberately, and they keep going away despite the criticisms. And we recently had an episode on our podcast about what's wrong with Liepāja, and we talked at length about this phenomena. So I'm not going to regurgitate here, but in essence, no, the FK Liepāja is not right now in any way, shape, or form a representative for the football tradition of Liepāja. But there is a club that has recently, this season got promoted to the Virslīga, and that club is called Grobiņa Sports Center. Grobiņa is a basically suburb of Liepāja. It's like 7 kilometers away. Used to be a major Viking city back in the 9th century, but they do have a football school that's affiliated with Liepāja, and they got promoted this year to the top flight. They are coached by Viktoras Dobricovs, who was the legendary striker of Liepājas Metalurgs and coach who won FK Liepāja's first Virslīga title back in 2014. And they are interesting because, well, simply put, if you look at the attendance when Liepāja plays, and then you look at the attendance when Grobiņa plays, which is pretty much all local players, with a few foreign players loaned from Liepāja, it's shocking, the difference. Pretty much no one comes to Liepāja games unless it's like a big game against one of the major Riga teams. And even then, one can argue that they're not there for Liepāja. But when Grobiņa plays, there's nowhere to sit. And recently we had a first derby where Liepāja played against Grobiņa, and it was just mad. The atmosphere in the stadium, the emotion, the passion of the people coming to support the players from their city, from this local region, to support Grobiņa. At the end of the day, Grobiņa won 3-2. Supporters rushed the fields, jumping, dancing with the players. It was just this unbridled, unfiltered, unadulterated joy. I couldn't be there, sadly. I was planning to, but even watching through the TV screen, I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. It was fantastic seeing the emotion of this football passion that runs in that city finally get this cathartic release, as Grobiņa is now representing the footballing tradition of the city, even if it does not have the name of any of the teams that preceded it in this tradition. So arguably, Grobiņa now would be the better representation or the better kind of a torch taker running with that tradition now than FK Liepāja, by all means. And it's fascinating, and it's wonderful to see.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think I really like this term that you've been using, football and tradition. And you've actually answered the question that I was going to ask you, which was going to be, are Grobiņa the ones who are carrying the torch for the football and tradition in Liepāja? And you've answered it perfectly. It very much sounds like they are, and it sounds like the city are behind them, which, considering they have FK Liepāja there to contend with almost, who have almost no fans or a dwindling fan base because they've shed their roots, if you want to say that, then it's really, really interesting to see, and it's really, really fascinating. I think this is such an interesting club to cover because it's not just a football club. As we said at the beginning, you can look through this club at the history of Latvian football, but it's also a great look into, as you mentioned, football tradition in a particular city. It's a great look into values. It's a fantastic look into identity behind football clubs as well. And I think for as complicated as it is, I think you've done a really, really fantastic job in untangling it and explaining to everyone why, just how fascinating it can be to look at subjects like this and look at the different contexts behind them as well.
Well, thank you very much. I genuinely don't think I've done that great of a job. It is a complex history with many nuances and factors. But if this gets anyone interested in having a look at what these teams are and why, I mean, that's already a win in my book. We've talked about Liepāja today, but as I mentioned in the beginning, the history of football in Latvia is very much a reflection of history of Latvia. And yeah, we have Liepāja, but we also had teams of Baltic Germans that were dissolved in 1939 when they went to Germany. And we had Jewish teams, and we had first Latvian teams. First one, so as I mentioned, first team ever in Latvia was in 1907. The first Latvian team only arrived in 1912. So we have, it's a rich history that I'm in no way qualified to disentangle without prior preparation. But Liepāja is a fascinating part of it, and it's a key part of it. It's definitely a city and a football tradition, as well as to a lesser extent a club, that is worth paying attention to and that none of us want to lose. So, especially in this podcast, we've been a bit harsh on Liepāja because of the things I mentioned just now, but no one wants to see Virslīga without Liepāja. A few years ago, we lost Ventspils, which was heartbreaking, and for some of very similar reasons as Liepāja is facing. And you know, it's an important part of Latvian football. Currently, Liepāja are struggling. They're in the last place after 11 rounds played, and alarm bells are ringing. And whether they'll be heard by club's management is an open question. So far, not looking super good. But if they need to get relegated for us to get Liepāja back, well, maybe that's not necessarily something that we wouldn't be willing to take.
Sometimes it isn't necessarily a bad thing if that happens. It almost gives the club a bit of a boost. It kind of leads me nicely on to the last thing that I was going to ask you just before we finish up for tonight. And it's a question that I've wondered about for quite some time, because it seems like a lot of clubs in Latvia at the moment and through the years have struggled quite a bit to stay afloat. And of course, there are always these clubs that spring up after a club dissolves. Some of them carry on the football tradition, some of them don't. But I just wondered, is there a particular reason? Is there something that can help stabilise football clubs in Latvia and stop more clubs from becoming lost in the future?
Well, you know, that is a question that I'm very, very interested in. In my day job, I'm a business school academic. And we face a very peculiar situation here, which I summarize in a question of how do you make money with no match day income or TV deals as a football club? And, you know, the range of answers to that is fairly restrictive. You either have rich benefactors, which has been the go-to, but that's risky. That's why Skonto tanked. That's in a sense why Liepājas Metalurg tanked, and that's why FK Liepāja is now in a state where, well, ownership doesn't have to care about what anyone else thinks about them. But then there's other ways, of course, and now with media and social media and proliferation of entertainment technology, there are other ways to potentially make money. And Virslīga as such is a great example to that. We had an episode a while back with the head of Virslīga where he very nicely outlined how they make money from selling data. So in essence, Latvian Championship is not a football championship as an organization. It's a data startup, which is fascinating in its own right. So why that happened, I feel like there's a range of reasons, but kind of shortly speaking, during the time when football in Europe underwent transition from this kind of a localized minority, a few people owning most of the club, and kind of focus on merchandise, focus on sponsors stage, to this large TV deals and broadcast money stage, we were still occupied. And so once the independence was restored and our clubs entered that stage, they entered in a position where the football game was now dominated by big money, or certainly beginning to get dominated by big money. and we didn't have the local support base in terms of like tens of thousands of spectators. That's just not happening. We didn't really have a market for football. TV broadcasting deals, well, you have Premier League, you had at that time the Italian Serie A, La Liga. No one's going to care about this newly restored Latvian national championship, not to pay money for it. So in essence, there wasn't a lot to turn to, and so the clubs became pretty much these vanity projects of rich, high net worth individuals, and that's highly unstable. And sadly, we still exist in some kind of a hybrid state where we can't fully commit to either the previous model, which is more fan-based, because we don't have attendances to help foot the bills, and we can't fully transition to the contemporary model because, honestly, Versliga doesn't get money from TV deals. They pay to have games produced. So there is that, and football is expensive. To be competitive on an international level, you need a lot of money. So it's a very precarious situation, which I think most clubs navigate admirably. And there are many interesting lessons, I think, that can be learned from how Latvian clubs existing in this situation, how they manage their business. But it is very difficult and it's precarious, and there is no best practice for how to deal with this because none of the big clubs have to deal with this.
Yeah, I thought when you mentioned there, there was a period of time where a lot of owners came in, rogue owners as well, and just wanted to use football teams either to asset strip or as a means to launder money or whatever else. There's a multitude of reasons. We see it all the time. We see it all over the world. It still happens, and it's something that when a football league in particular is trying to find its feet or going through a really tumultuous time, it's something that can really destabilise it. The hope would be that in the future things can stabilise a little bit and the Versliga and the clubs involved can get some more financial backing to make sure that they don't end up going defunct. Because as you said, it would be a real shame. The Versliga, as well as leagues all over the world, aren't the same without the clubs that are in them now or the clubs that have come before. So it's something that we can only hope for. Now, we've been talking for well over an hour, Dmitrijs. I'm very, very grateful for your time. I'm aware it's very, very late where you are at the moment. So the final question is just if there's anything else you want to add before we finish up.
I think another important context to kind of keep in mind when we talk about Latvian football is that all the things you mentioned about clubs going bust, they're bad, but they also give football a bad name. And in a country where football is not a number one sport, and especially in a country where football had, because of these Russification efforts that our leading teams were subjected to, kind of has a bad rep associated with that. Any club that goes bust because of match fixing scandal or money laundering scandal just turns so many more people away from football. 10 years ago, football was still number one sport in Latvia. Now it's not even close. It's number 3. We have basketball and ice hockey before that. It's the most taken up sport in terms of child participation, and it's the richest sport by far. And if we're looking at attendance on association level, also leading, but still somehow it just doesn't have good reputation. And that is something that we need to work at, and that's something that we're working to dealing with. So there are many, many challenges for us and for countries similar to ours. Estonia and Lithuania are immediate neighbors, but I also suspect that maybe other countries that were under Soviet occupation or maybe elsewhere in the world that are facing. But there are also unique aspects to Latvia, and that being that football is really not a religion here, not at all. But we love it nonetheless, and we definitely want more people to enjoy it. There's a lot to enjoy, and it's only getting better year on year. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about Liepāja, probably an otherwise obscure city in minds of most of your listeners. No offense if it isn't. And it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolutely great conversation. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and we've covered quite a lot of detail and a lot of nuances as well. I think that was really important context you gave at the end. As you mentioned, Latvian football is growing. It's getting better every year. And if any of our listeners want to find out more about football in Latvia, of course, you can go and check out the Latvian Football Podcast, which Dmitrijs is the host of. Got a Twitter page as well. You can go and see everything about it. To all our listeners who tuned in, thank you once again for listening to this episode. It's probably been one of my favourite episodes of the series, to be completely honest with you. Just absolutely fantastic. Some of the themes that I pulled out there, and Dmitrijs' knowledge, just always a great guy to have a chat with, I think is at the essence of it. If there's a story that you want us to tell or a topic that you want us to cover, then please get in touch with us. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. It can be anything related to football history and heritage, whether that's fan identities, culture, community, politics, place, grounds, stadiums, lost clubs, you name it. We're open to have a chat with you to see if it's something that fits our project. You can also go and check out our website in the meantime, which is footballheritage.co.uk, where all of our fantastic written content goes up from our wonderful contributors. For now, Dmitrijs, say goodbye.
Thank you so much, and farewell.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.